The Pacific War has reached its cruel crescendo, an inferno stretched from the Marianas to the Philippines. On the island of Saipan, U.S. Marines land beneath a sun that seems to burn as fiercely as the artillery around them. Ahead lies not open terrain, but a labyrinth, a fortress carved from volcanic stone. Every ridge hides a gun, every shadow conceals a tunnel. The Japanese have turned nature itself into a defense. Caves cut deep into the hillsides are linked by passages too narrow for men to crawl through upright. Bunkers of reinforced concrete overlook killing fields of sand and ash. When the Marines advance, they are met not by lines of soldiers, but by silence, then sudden fire. Machine guns rake the beaches, slicing through the first waves. Grenades tossed into openings disappear into darkness, exploding harmlessly in empty chambers. Even flamethrower teams, advancing on foot, find their fuel spent before they reach the next cave mouth. Each victory costs a dozen lives. Each yard of ground feels borrowed, not won. Inside the tunnels, the defenders move like ghosts. Japanese soldiers, ordered to fight to the death, shift positions unseen. To them, the cave is not a prison, it is protection, a sacred vow carved in stone. They know that the Americans will come, and they intend to make them bleed for every breath. The island's black rock, its jagged ridges and molten scars, seem to agree. For the Marines, courage is no longer enough. Bravery cannot burn the enemy out of the earth. Conventional weapons, bullets, shells, grenades, are useless against walls of stone. The problem is not just tactical, it is existential. How do you fight an enemy who has buried himself inside the planet? At field headquarters, engineers and officers argue over solutions. Demolition charges, satchel explosives, poison gas, none seem workable. Then comes a brutal simplicity. Fire. Not handheld and fleeting, but sustained and mobile. Fire that can crawl forward under armor, reach into the ground, and deny the enemy even the air he breathes. Orders are sent across the Pacific. New machines are to be built. Tanks that carry not shells, but flame. The age of the flamethrower tank has begun, and with it, the war in the Pacific is about to change forever. When American Marines first step into the jungles of the Marianas, they find not a battlefield, but a maze. What looks like wilderness hides an empire beneath the earth, one built by the engineers of the Imperial Japanese Army. In the years before the invasion, they have reshaped entire islands, carving them into fortresses of rock and coral. Every hill is hollowed out. Every ridge conceals a network of tunnels, pillboxes, and gun chambers. The entrances are invisible until they open in sudden violence. Inside, the tunnels twist like veins through volcanic stone. Dry black corridors, lined with crates of ammunition, water tanks, and the faint smell of oil. Soldiers sleep beside their rifles, knowing they will never leave these rooms alive. Each position is designed to fight, then die. Communication cables run through the rock, linking hundreds of self-contained bunkers, each prepared for the last stand. If one is destroyed, the others carry on, sealed off behind steel and lava. Above ground, the jungle sways innocently, erasing all trace of what waits below. The Americans call them spider holes. It is a name born from fear, small, unseen, and endlessly connected. No matter how many are destroyed, more seem to appear. The Marines learn quickly that they are not fighting soldiers in the open, but shadows in the ground. Artillery, the weapon that won Europe, becomes nearly useless here. Shells strike the surface, sending dust and leaves into the air, but the men below remain untouched. Even naval gunfire, the heaviest in the world, barely dents the rock. The island itself becomes armor. For the Japanese defenders, this is proof of divine design. The islands are their shields, their sanctuaries, the bones of the earth protecting the empire. They believe that no weapon can reach them in their caverns, no flame can find them through stone. It is not arrogance alone, it is faith. They have spent years preparing for the inevitable. Now, surrounded and outnumbered, they believe they have achieved invincibility through terrain. Each soldier's orders are absolute. Die in place, let no enemy pass. There will be no retreats, no withdrawals, no surrenders. They dig in with the calm of men who already consider themselves dead. Their confidence is not loud, it is the silence of inevitability. As American engineers study captured maps and cave blueprints, a realization begins to form. These defenses cannot be destroyed by speed or numbers. They require something elemental, a weapon that can reach inside the earth itself. Infantry attacks will only feed the tunnels with more bodies. Explosives can collapse a chamber, but not cleanse it. The challenge is not just tactical, it is philosophical. How do you fight an enemy who has removed himself from the surface of the world? The first attempts are grimly inventive. Engineers pour fuel into openings and ignite it. Others use demolition charges, hoping to suffocate the bunkers by oxygen depletion. The results are uneven, costly, and often suicidal. The caves consume men as easily as they consume munitions. Yet each failed assault pushes the Americans closer to a conclusion. To defeat the enemy beneath the ground, they must bring the ground itself to flame. Far from the front, in the workshops of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, a new idea begins to take shape. A machine that can project liquid fire, not for seconds, but for minutes. One that can breathe heat into the very heart of the rock. The Japanese soldiers in their tunnels believe they have found refuge. What they do not yet know is that refuge will soon become a furnace. They are about to meet a weapon that breathes fire. The idea of fire as a weapon is ancient, older than steel, older than strategy, but in modern war, it returned with a mechanical edge. By 1943, the U.S. infantry carried portable flamethrowers, metal cylinders strapped to the back, hoses ending in a wand of ignition. They were terrifying, effective, and nearly suicidal to use. Each carried only seconds of fuel. Each operator exposed the moment the trigger was pulled. The flash of fire gave away position instantly, drawing machine gun bursts and sniper rounds. On the islands of the Pacific, flamethrower men were hunted first and remembered last. To carry one was both a duty and a death sentence. Commanders recognized its usefulness, but its limits were clear. Against caves, bunkers, and pillboxes, the core of Japan's defense, infantry flames lacked reach, endurance, and protection. Fire, by itself, was not enough. What it needed was armor. In the workshops of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, an idea began to take form. If the flame could be combined with a tank's strength, it could turn from desperation to doctrine. Engineers from the Army and Navy pooled their knowledge, joined by chemists from the Chemical Warfare Service. Together, they began experimenting with new combinations of pressure, fuel, and ignition. The first test bed was small and crude, the light M3 Stuart, already considered obsolete for frontline combat. Mechanics stripped out the cannon and mounted a cylindrical fuel tank and pump system in its place. When tested, it belched a stream of burning gasoline almost 40 yards long, its roar echoing across the Hawaiian training fields. The men watching gave it a nickname, the Satan. Each test was equal parts science and spectacle. Flame arced across the tropical sky, turning palm groves into pyres. The engineers measured range, duration, and temperature with the detachment of laboratory technicians, yet they could not ignore what they were witnessing. The fuel mixture, thickened gasoline, pressurized by nitrogen, clung to whatever it touched. It did not just burn, it consumed. Field officers watched in silence. The implications were immediate and undeniable. Here was a weapon that could clear a bunker in seconds, that could reach into the earth and strip it of its defenders. For the first time, the thought of assaulting a fortified cave did not seem suicidal. The combination of fire and armor had transformed terror into method. But even in success, unease lingered. The weapon's destructive power was absolute and impersonal. The crew remained sealed inside their steel hulls, protected from the heat they unleashed. Outside, the jungle was reduced to smoke and ash. One marine observer wrote later, "It was like watching nature itself take sides." The prototypes, rough but effective, were approved for production. The Army called them flame tanks. The Navy preferred mechanized flamethrowers. Among the men who would drive them, another name emerged, darker, more fitting: Dragons. The tests continued, refining nozzles, pumps, and fuel pressure. Each improvement made the stream longer, hotter, more reliable. Fire, once the domain of the individual, had become an industrial process, measured in gallons, projected in arcs, controlled by levers. What began as a desperate adaptation was becoming doctrine. The Pacific had demanded a weapon that could reach into the ground. America had found one. And in the jungles of Saipan, where the earth itself seemed to fight back, that weapon was about to make its first appearance. In a warehouse on Oahu, the engineers kept working, unaware that the machine they had just built would soon become the face of fear itself. The M4 Sherman was never meant to breathe fire. It had been designed for speed, for reliability, for the long, grinding marches across Europe's fields, not for the volcanic crucible of the Pacific. Yet it was here, amid coral dust and jungle heat, that the Sherman found its second purpose. Its broad hull, its dependable engine, and its generous interior space made it an ideal host for something entirely new. The tank that once carried shells would now carry flame. In the early months of 1944, engineers from the Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service, or POA-CWS, arrived on Hawaii with orders that blurred the line between invention and desperation. Their task? To transform a workhorse of American armor into a weapon that could burn an island from the inside out. The idea was simple. The execution was not. They began by removing the tank's cannon, the symbol of armored might, and replacing it with a pipe. Inside the hull, fuel tanks were welded into place, capable of holding hundreds of gallons of thickened gasoline. Nitrogen cylinders were installed to pressurize the mixture. Hydraulic pumps forced the liquid through hoses toward a nozzle mounted in the mantlet. The ignition came from twin magnesium cartridges, sparked by electricity and timed to milliseconds. When triggered, the system could send a stream of fire more than 100 yards, a river of flame under pressure. The crews who trained to use it gave the machine a nickname that mixed awe with dread: the Zippo. It was part humor, part warning, after the cigarette lighter that shared its purpose. To operate one was to sit inside a rolling fuel tank, surrounded by volatile gasoline, knowing that a single hit could turn protection into pyre. They joked grimly, "We carry hell in a tank." Every test revealed a new danger. In the heat of the Pacific, the nitrogen tanks expanded unpredictably. Hydraulic seals cracked. The first field trials ended in explosions. On one occasion, a flame burst back through the nozzle, igniting the tank's own fuel stores. The crew was incinerated before they could escape. Their loss became the next lesson in design. Each failure pushed the engineers closer to mastery. Each improvement was written in blood. The flamethrower Sherman evolved through trial and ruin. The models built at Schofield Barracks and Oahu's workshops grew safer, stronger, more efficient. The range increased from 50 yards to 100 and beyond. A full tank of fuel could now sustain 90 seconds of continuous flame, enough to turn an entire hillside into a furnace. The machine's roar was so deep that infantrymen said they could feel it through the ground. To operate one required coordination and nerve. The driver advanced only as far as visibility allowed, often just a few feet. The gunner aimed through periscopes clouded by heat and smoke, judging distance by instinct. When the trigger was pulled, the tank shook violently, its interior lighting up orange as reflected fire filled the optics. Outside, the stream struck its target and spread, crawling along rock, seeping into caves, filling every space with living fire. Yet the cost of perfection was patience. For every working Zippo, another sat half-complete, its hoses leaking, its seals failing. The men of POA-CWS worked through nights under the hum of arc welders, improvising with whatever parts could be found. In letters home, one mechanic wrote, "We are not building machines, we are building inevitability." By mid-1944, the first combat-ready flamethrower Shermans stood on the docks of Saipan, their nozzles capped, their hulls streaked with salt. The crews had trained in secrecy, learning the weapon's rhythms, its dangers, its limits. They knew what it could do and what it could not. They also knew there was no other choice. The island war had entered a stage where courage alone could no longer win ground. Now, fire would lead the way. And as the ships pulled away from Oahu, their decks heavy with tanks that glowed faintly in the sunlight, no one yet knew that these machines, crude, dangerous, and unstoppable, would soon baptize an entire island in flame. June 1944. The island of Saipan rises from the Pacific like a black tooth, jagged, volcanic, and fortified to its core. For months, Japanese engineers have carved the rock into a honeycomb of caves and bunkers, each linked by tunnels, each prepared for death. When the Marines come ashore, they meet not an army, but a fortress disguised as an island. The invasion begins under thunder. Naval guns churn the beaches into storms of sand and smoke. Waves of landing craft grind forward through the surf. Men crouched low beneath artillery bursts that seem to fall everywhere at once. The Japanese defenders, dug deep into coral ridges, wait in silence until the Marines are close enough to see. Then the island comes alive. Machine guns rake the beaches. Mortars fall like rain. Every advance collapses under fire from unseen openings in the cliffs. Grenades bounce harmlessly off bunker walls. Infantrymen crawl forward, inch by inch, into a landscape that seems to swallow them whole. By dusk, progress is measured not in yards, but in bodies. That night, under the dim light of flares, the new machines are brought ashore. Modified Shermans, their turrets replaced by nozzles, their hulls carrying hundreds of gallons of fuel. To the men who see them for the first time, they look ordinary, but the crews inside know what they carry. They call them Zippos. They are armored reservoirs of fire. At dawn, the experiment begins. The first flamethrower tank lurches forward alongside a platoon pinned by gunfire. Its engine growls across the coral plain, tracks grinding through mud and debris. Then the nozzle rises. A white spark flashes, followed by a roar that drowns out everything else. A stream of burning fuel arcs through the air and lands against the hillside. Liquid fire that clings, spreads, and devours. Within seconds, the cave's mouth becomes a furnace. The machine gun fire stops instantly. Inside, the temperature rises beyond comprehension. The sound of battle turns into a deep, rolling hiss as oxygen itself burns away. The Marines, who have fought for days against stone and silence, stare in disbelief. The bunker that cost dozens of lives to reach is gone in seconds. They advance behind the curtain of flame, clearing ground that had seemed impossible hours before. For the first time on Saipan, courage is no longer measured by how far a man can run under fire, but by how long he can watch what happens next. The smell of cordite fades, replaced by something heavier, the stench of burning oil and scorched earth. The ground smokes for minutes after each burst, the air thick and metallic. Survivors flee from their tunnels only to meet the next wave of flame. Others never emerge. Reporters embedded with the Marines record what they see in clinical detail. The most effective weapon yet used, one writes. Commanders echo the sentiment in their after-action reports. The flamethrower tank, they conclude, has changed the calculus of war. Where artillery and infantry failed, fire has succeeded, not by precision, but by inevitability. But among the ranks, triumph mingles with unease. Some Marines cheer, others look away. The victory feels absolute, but unnatural. As one lieutenant later recalled, it wasn't a fight, it was an ending. By week's end, the remaining Japanese defenders withdraw deeper into the island's heart, their confidence in the earth itself shaken. The bunkers that once promised immortality have become tombs. The soldiers who survive begin to whisper of a new American weapon, a tank that kills with heat and breathes like a dragon. The doctrine of bunker warfare, once the pride of Japan's island defense, is obsolete. The flame has rewritten it in a single campaign, and as the tanks are refueled, their nozzles cooling in the tropical rain, no one yet knows that Saipan was only the beginning, that on another island of black rock and ash, the fire will rise higher still. War often measures men by courage, by who advances, who holds, who dies standing. But on Saipan, courage itself met its limit. Japanese soldiers, raised on the creed of Bushido, had been taught that the sword and the will were stronger than any weapon. They believed that valor could defy death, that to die fighting was to die with honor. Yet the flamethrower tank introduced a terror that no code could withstand. It denied them air, sight, and dignity, the three things a warrior could still claim in defeat. Inside the caves, the heat came before the light. The roar of pressurized fuel echoed through the tunnels like thunder underground. Then came the fire, liquid, crawling, clinging to stone and skin alike. Men had no time to raise their rifles or cry out. Those who survived the first blast often ended it themselves, clutching grenades to their chests, choosing a soldier's death over an unrecognizable one. American Marines watched from the ridgelines and felt the line blur between victory and vengeance. They had begged for a weapon that could finally breach the fortresses. Now they watched as it erased not just the enemy, but the idea of battle itself. It was like burning men out of existence, one corporal wrote. There was no fight left, just fire. The sight left marks deeper than scars. Some Marines turned away from the flame, unable to watch what they had asked for. Others shouted, not from triumph, but from release, an instinctive reaction to months of frustration and fear. To them, the caves had become the embodiment of every unseen enemy, every ambush, every friend buried in volcanic dust. Fire, for a moment, felt like justice. Then it felt like guilt. For the chaplains who moved with the battalions, the moral arithmetic of war became harder to explain. How does mercy survive when the method of victory consumes everything it touches? They heard confessions whispered through the sound of engines, questions about souls burned before they could surrender, about what it meant to be the instrument of that destruction. One chaplain wrote simply, "I pray now for the living and for the burned." The Japanese, for their part, came to fear flame more than shells or bullets. Artillery they could endure, shrapnel they could hide from. But the fire crept into every refuge. It filled the spaces between courage and despair. It turned their sacred caves into crematoriums. For a soldier who had promised to die honorably, the thought of dying unseen, burning in darkness, felt like erasure. Some charged from their tunnels into the open, screaming, bayonets fixed, preferring a bullet to the fire's embrace. Even for those untouched by flame, the weapon changed perception. The jungle itself seemed to recoil, leaves curling, air shimmering, the world momentarily made of smoke. The boundary between human and elemental disappeared. On Saipan, man had not just mastered fire, he had weaponized nature's oldest fear. By the campaign's end, both sides understood that something irreversible had occurred. Technology had stripped war of its illusion of honor. Bravery, once the defining virtue, was now powerless against invention. The battlefield had become a furnace, and in its reflection, each army saw not its enemy, but itself. For the Americans, the weapon had worked. The bunkers were silent. The caves were empty. But victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like survival. And as the tanks cooled and smoke drifted out to sea, a new understanding settled in. The enemy could be defeated by fire, but humanity might burn with him. February 1945. The island of Iwo Jima rises from the Pacific like a wound. 8 square miles of black volcanic ash, cliffs, and smoke. From the air, it looks barren, lifeless, but beneath its crust lies a city of war. 20,000 Japanese soldiers, entombed in tunnels and bunkers, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He has sworn that no man under his command will surrender, and no invader will leave the island unchanged. For days before the landing, naval guns pound Iwo Jima into dust. Battleships unleash the heaviest bombardment of the Pacific War. The surface dissolves into ash, but the men below endure. Their tunnels are 40 feet deep, with walls of hardened lava. Kuribayashi has built not a fortress, but an organism. Every gun, every passage, every soldier connected to the next. When the bombardment ceases, silence returns, unbroken and defiant. On February 19th, the Marines come ashore. The beach is black sand that swallows their boots, their vehicles, their dead. Machine guns open from invisible positions. Mortars fall like rain. The landing zone becomes a graveyard of motion, men crawling forward into smoke that has no direction. Every hill conceals an enemy. Every rock conceals a gun. For the flamethrower tanks, the Zippos, it is the most unforgiving terrain yet. Their tracks churn helplessly in the soft ash, engines overheating, armor blistered by volcanic heat. But they move anyway, slow, deliberate, crawling like predators through the inferno. The infantry stays close, using the tanks as both cover and compass. Where the Zippos move, the living follow. Each cave becomes an eruption. A Sherman angles its turret, the nozzle rising like the snout of a dragon. Then, a flash, a roar, a river of fire. The fuel strikes the rock face and splits, seeping into cracks and openings, turning them into chimneys. Black smoke billows out in thick columns, coating the sky. The fire doesn't just kill, it consumes the air, the oxygen, the silence. Inside the caves, the defenders fight the fire with grenades, rifles, and faith. Some die firing, others die praying. For every tunnel cleared, a dozen remain. The battle becomes a ritual of repetition. Advance, ignite, suffocate, move on. Marines mark each position, not by name but by what remains. The burned one, the hot one, the quiet one. Kuribayashi's men refuse to flee. His orders are absolute. Fight until death, but die where you stand. Even so, the weapon they face breaks more than their bodies. It dismantles their sense of invincibility. The flame crawls where bullets cannot, filling the earth they once trusted. It reaches into their sanctuaries and leaves nothing but silence. After days of fighting, Mount Suribachi, the island's volcanic heart, becomes the focus. Its slopes are riddled with caves and gun ports, its summit a black silhouette against the sky. The Zippos climb it slowly, flanked by Marines on foot, every step contested. The mountain fights back with machine guns and mortars, but the tanks reply with fire. Entire ridges ignite. The volcano seems alive again, exhaling flame from every wound. When the summit finally falls, the Marines raise the flag. The moment is immortalized in a photograph. 6 men, 1 banner, a symbol of endurance. But below that image, the battle still rages on. The island will not surrender. For another month, the fighting continues underground, in darkness, in heat, in airless chambers where fire and flesh trade places. By the time Iwo Jima is declared secure, 600 to 800 Americans are dead. Nearly all 20,000 Japanese defenders have perished. The island is reduced to glass and dust. Its tunnels are filled with ash, and through that ruin, one truth stands unshaken. The Americans have built a weapon perfectly suited to the Pacific's version of hell. On Iwo Jima, even the mountain burned. The Earth itself became a participant in the war, as though the planet had chosen a side. But beyond this blackened island, another fortress awaited, one larger, older, and even more determined to endure. The next battle would not just test the flamethrower tank, it would test humanity's remaining capacity for mercy. April 1945. The island of Okinawa looms at the southern edge of Japan's home waters, 60 miles long, steeped in ancient tombs and coral ridges. To conquer it is to open the road to Tokyo itself. To defend it, the Japanese have built their final fortress. More than 100,000 soldiers under General Mitsuru Ushijima dig into the island's limestone hills. Their positions form a continuous line across the southern half of the island, a defensive labyrinth of caves, gun pits, tunnels, and concealed artillery. The Marines who land on the beaches find no enemy waiting, only silence. The first day feels almost easy. The second, the ground begins to move. Machine guns open from the hills, mortars burst among the landing craft, and artillery shells erupt from unseen positions. Okinawa is not a battlefield. It is an ambush that lasts 3 months. The Japanese have withdrawn deliberately into the earth, forcing the Americans to come to them, yard by yard, cave by cave. By now, the Americans have learned the pattern of this war. They know the sound of an unseen gun, the shape of a tunnel mouth disguised by foliage, and they bring with them the weapon that made Saipan and Iwo Jima burn, the flamethrower tank. The Shermans of Okinawa move in coordinated teams, flame tanks, engineers, and bulldozers advancing together like an armored organism. The bulldozers flatten ridges and expose cave entrances. The engineers mark targets with smoke, then the Zippos advance, their nozzles rising, their crews calm and deliberate. When the trigger is pulled, 100 yards of fire erupts in a single breath. Whole hillsides ignite. Tombs carved centuries earlier become pyres. The fire seeps into cracks and fissures, filling the island's lungs. Japanese counterattacks dissolve in the smoke, their momentum turned to panic. One Marine officer wrote, "They no longer charged us. They tried to outrun the flame." For the men who fight, the effectiveness of the weapon is beyond question. Each burst shortens a battle that might otherwise last days. Yet the moral toll deepens with every victory. Even hardened veterans, men who have endured years of war, avert their eyes from what follows. "We didn't cheer," a sergeant recalled. "We just waited for it to stop." The defenders, trapped between duty and despair, face choices stripped of honor. Many rush from the caves in suicidal charges. Others die where they stand, their bodies turned to shadow against the rock. Some civilians, hiding among them, are caught in the fire, their presence known only by the absence that follows. The island itself seems to grieve. Rain falls almost daily, mixing with soot to form rivers of black mud. Burned trees collapse into the ash. Marines march past open caves where the air still shimmers from heat. For every bunker cleared, another appears beyond the next ridge, as if the island were birthing new defenses faster than they can be destroyed. The fighting grinds on into May. The Japanese line bends, but does not break. At Shuri Castle, the heart of the defensive system, the final stand unfolds. Artillery flattens the ancient walls. Flamethrower tanks encircle the fortress and fire in relays, their flames visible for miles. The once sacred ground becomes a furnace. By June, the resistance is finished. The hills are quiet again, the caves empty except for smoke. Of the Japanese garrison, fewer than 8,000 survive. Civilians lie among them, victims of a war that has consumed everything: stone, soil, and soul. For the Americans, Okinawa is a victory without celebration. 30,000 casualties, 12,000 dead. The island has been taken, but at a cost that feels more like confession than triumph. Commanders study the reports, calculating what an invasion of the Japanese mainland would mean. The numbers defy comprehension. The flamethrower tanks have proven themselves beyond doubt. They are the perfect instruments for the Pacific. Efficient, devastating, final. And yet, for those who have seen their work, there is a shared silence, a wordless understanding that something human has been scorched away along with the enemy. The last fortress has fallen, but in its ashes, both armies glimpse the same truth, that victory by fire leaves no victors at all. In war, not every weapon is measured by destruction alone. Some are judged by what they do to the mind. By the spring of 1945, the American commanders in the Pacific understood that the flamethrower tank did more than destroy fortifications. It dismantled belief. Captured Japanese soldiers, when interrogated, spoke with voices stripped of conviction. They described the weapon not as a machine, but as a living terror. Artillery could be endured. Bombs could be outlasted. But fire denied everything: cover, visibility, breath, and hope. When it came, one prisoner said, it took the air before it took the body. For men trained to see death as sacred, flame was not death, it was erasure. Reports from the front confirmed what the prisoners said. Even the most fortified cave became a trap once the Zippos arrived. The defenders would fire until the nozzle turned toward them, and then they stopped being soldiers. Some fled screaming into the open. Others took their own lives before the fire reached them. Entire positions surrendered not to numbers or tactics, but to the sound of the approaching tank, the hiss of its pumps, the faint click before ignition. American commanders began to recognize what they were witnessing: psychological warfare made physical. The flamethrower was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of anticipation. Its power lay in the moment before it struck, in the knowledge that there was nowhere to run. It burned courage as effectively as it burned stone. Military analysts after the war would call it mechanized fear. For the Japanese, whose doctrine prized honor above survival, the flame tank inverted the entire moral order of combat. Death by fire was considered shameful, unclean, devoid of grace. To face it was to face a form of annihilation that stripped away the very ideals they fought for. The bunker was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a coffin waiting to be lit. Yet on the other side of the battlefield, victory carried its own corrosion. The Americans who operated these weapons found little satisfaction in their effectiveness. The act itself, deliberate, close, inescapable, lingered in the mind. "You didn't see men die," one Marine said. you saw them vanish. Some spoke of nightmares filled with light and sound, of the smell that clung to their uniforms long after the fighting stopped. In official reports, the flamethrower tank was praised as the most efficient tool of the Pacific campaign. But efficiency came at a cost that statistics could not measure. After-action summaries noted the weapon's morale effects on the enemy, a sanitized phrase for the transformation of battle into terror. Chaplains called it a victory touched by sorrow. Historians later described it as the moment when technology outpaced the moral imagination of those who wielded it. For the men who drove the Zippos, the line between necessity and cruelty grew faint. They told themselves, correctly, that each bunker burned saved a dozen lives outside it, that the weapon was merciful in its finality. Yet as the war dragged on, mercy itself seemed to warp, replaced by the mechanical repetition of cause and consequence. The flame didn't discriminate, and neither could the men who used it. Fire, in its perfection, made the battlefield simple again. It was the purest form of dominance, visible, instant, final. But in that simplicity lay the horror. There was no valor in facing it, no poetry in surviving it. Both sides came to see it not as victory or defeat, but as judgment. By the time Okinawa fell, the weapon's reputation had grown beyond the battlefield. To the enemy, it was a curse. To the Americans, a burden. Fire had won every contest it entered, but each victory left behind a silence no one wanted to break. And as the war neared its end, the question remained, what happens to those who master fear when the only thing left to fear is themselves? By mid-1945, the weapon that began as an experiment had become a system. The M4A3R3, known among Marines simply as the Zippo, rolled out of depots across the Pacific with quiet precision. Its specifications spoke a language of engineering, not emotion. A range of 150 yards, a fuel capacity of 290 gallons, and a pressurized system capable of releasing liquid fire at 200 feet per second. It was no longer improvisation, it was design. Each tank was the result of thousands of calculations. The pressure of nitrogen against steel, the viscosity of napalm mixtures, the cooling rate of flame nozzles under sustained use. Every part of the system had to survive both heat and fear. A jammed valve could turn victory into self-destruction in seconds. Crewmen learned to think of their machines as living things, dangerous, temperamental, alive. You had to treat the flame unit like a heart, one operator recalled. It kept beating as long as you did. Inside the Pacific Ocean area chemical warfare service workshops, mechanics worked through the night, adapting ordinary Shermans for extraordinary tasks. Welders replaced machine guns with flame projectors. Pumps were installed where guns once rested. The familiar turret silhouette remained, but what it carried inside had changed forever. The transformation was both mechanical and symbolic. America had learned how to make fear function. Crew drills became ritualized: ignite, sweep, withdraw. No movement wasted, no delay permitted. In training yards on Hawaii and Saipan, tankers practiced in mock caves carved from coral. They fired into trenches filled with water and oil, learning to control not the weapon's power, but its rhythm. Each burst was timed to seconds, each sweep calibrated to fuel efficiency. To survive in the Zippo was to live by precision. Behind the front lines, the assembly lines told another story. Factories in Hawaii and California turned out conversion kits by the hundreds: metal casings, hoses, regulators, and igniters. Each kit represented a single battlefield equation: one tank, one cleared position, one fewer bunker. It was industrial warfare stripped to its logic. Fire had become a measurable commodity. The men who built them understood their purpose, but rarely spoke of it. Engineers filled reports with numbers and tolerances, avoiding words like burn or kill. To them, it was function, pressure, range, and reliability, yet in every component there was a shadow. They were manufacturing not just machines, but inevitability. When the M4A3R3 reached the battlefield, its effect was immediate. The new tanks were safer, their flame range longer, their fuel systems stable under fire. The crews who once carried buckets of fuel and prayed their hoses wouldn't rupture now felt an unfamiliar sensation: confidence. In Okinawa's final weeks, the Zippos moved with the precision of a metronome: flame, pause, reload, advance. For the infantry, watching from behind, it was the mechanical rhythm of deliverance. But among the officers and engineers, a quiet unease began to grow. They had achieved what they set out to create: a perfect weapon for imperfect terrain. Yet perfection in war carries its own gravity. The better the weapon, the less room there is for humanity. Each improvement stripped away uncertainty, and with it, reflection. As one designer later admitted, "We learned how to make terror reliable." By the summer of 1945, the M4A3R3 stood as the pinnacle of its kind, the most effective flamethrower tank ever built. And just as it reached that peak, its purpose began to fade. The war it was made for was ending, replaced by one that would fight with different fires altogether. Industry had mastered fear, but in the next chapter, fear itself would change form. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most unforgiving chapter. The Japanese army, shattered yet unyielding, had retreated into the earth, not to hide, but to die. The caves of Okinawa, the cliffs of Peleliu, the tunnels of Iwo Jima, all had become sanctuaries of death. For the defenders, surrender was unthinkable. For the attackers, hesitation was fatal. The flamethrower tank now stood at the center of this grim equation. Wherever the fighting reached its most desperate, the Zippos were called forward. They did not roar into battle like other tanks. They advanced with the slow inevitability of a tide. Their crews knew the weight of what they carried, a weapon not just of destruction, but of decision. Inside the caves, Japanese soldiers waited for the end. They could hear the engines before they saw the flame. The sound was unmistakable, a deep mechanical growl followed by the hiss of pressurized fuel. Then came the light, white and blinding, flooding every crack in the rock. Oxygen vanished, the air turned liquid. Caves collapsed, as if the island itself rejected its inhabitants. Screams echoed through the lava corridors, human voices swallowed by an inhuman sound. The fire did not discriminate between soldier or stone, between the living and the already dead. When the smoke cleared, the bunkers were silent, the caves unrecognizable. For the Marines outside, there was no joy in what they had done, only relief that it was over. The medics who followed behind treated wounds that defied description: burned flesh, seared lungs, eyes clouded by heat. There was no distinction between friend and foe. American tankers whose machines had backfired lay beside the very men they had sought to kill. "We were all burned by the same flame," one corpsman later said. In those makeshift aid stations, the line between sides blurred, and the war's purpose seemed to vanish with it. Among the chaplains, notebooks filled with confessions. Tank crews spoke not of glory, but of guilt. They described nightmares of caves that still burned, of faces they could not forget. "Father," one Marine whispered, "I think I sent them to hell while they were still alive." The chaplain wrote no judgment in reply, only the phrase, "Mercy follows all things, even fire." Commanders, reading these reports, sought to restore reason where conscience faltered. They reminded their men that every bunker destroyed spared hundreds of attackers. That flame, though terrible, had saved lives. It was the argument of necessity, true but incomplete. For the soldiers who saw the results up close, necessity was no comfort. The moral arithmetic of war had lost its symmetry. As the battles wore on, justification hardened into burden. The tankers began to operate with a grim detachment, efficient, precise, and silent. Each burst of fire became less an act of anger than of duty. They stopped naming the caves they cleared. They stopped counting the days. In the official reports, words like neutralized replaced burned. Language, too, became armor. On the other side, fanaticism held its ground. Japanese soldiers fought without illusion. Their emperor had ordered them to defend to the last, and they obeyed. To die by the sword was honorable. To die by fire was desecration. Yet still they fought, not for victory, but for proof that spirit could endure even in defeat. Their courage was absolute. Their fate was certain. By the time the last islands fell, the pattern was complete. Fire had conquered what bombs could not. The bunkers were empty, the defenders ash. The weapon had achieved perfection in both function and consequence. It had reduced war to its purest, most unbearable truth: survival through annihilation. In the days that followed, the Zippos were parked under the open sun, their nozzles cooling, their fuel tanks dry. Mechanics wiped soot from the armor in silence. The smell of burned earth clung to everything, to uniforms, to memories, to history itself. The war had been won. But in the stillness that followed, it was unclear who had truly triumphed: the men who built the fire, or the fire that had learned to live through them. Ahead lay the final reckoning, not on a battlefield, but in the soul of a nation that had turned necessity into flame. By August 1945, the Pacific Ocean was quiet again, too quiet for the living. The islands that once burned with defiance now lay blackened, their tunnels collapsed, their guns silent. The Japanese doctrine of island defense, once hailed as invincible, had turned to dust. Its promise of endurance had dissolved in smoke. The empire that built fortresses from coral and courage was ending not with a charge, but with a silence. From Saipan to Okinawa, the same pattern had played out. The deeper the defenders dug, the further the fire reached. What was meant to protect became a prison. The caves that symbolized devotion became graves of stone and ash. The flamethrower tanks, those slow, relentless instruments of heat, had broken not just fortifications, but the faith that sustained them. In Tokyo, the last surviving generals reviewed the reports in disbelief. They saw not defeat by numbers, but by invention. Every new weapon, the flamethrower, the napalm canister, the B-29 bomber, carried the same message. Japan had been out-engineered. What they called spirit had met a power that did not rely on spirit at all, only fuel, pressure, and precision. In private, even the most devoted officers admitted the truth. The flamethrower tanks had done more than destroy positions. They had destroyed the will to fight. Soldiers hiding in bunkers no longer saw glory in resistance. They saw suffocation, heat, and the inevitability of fire. The weapon broke morale before the bomb. One surviving staff officer confessed after the war. By the time the fire reached our shores, our courage had already burned away. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the empire that had once sought purity in sacrifice witnessed destruction beyond understanding. But for those who had seen the island wars up close, the shock felt strangely familiar. The flame that had rolled across Saipan and Okinawa was now falling from the sky. The scale had changed. The principle had not. In the Pacific, the Zippos stood idle, their engines cooled, their nozzles rusting under the tropical sun. They were relics of a war that had ended faster than anyone could comprehend. The tanks that had once carried fire across the jungle were now parked beside runways where jet aircraft prepared to usher in a different age, one where destruction required no proximity, no courage, no witness. Historians later wrote that the empire fell to strategy, to logistics, to overwhelming force. But for the men who fought it, the truth was more intimate. Japan's strength had been built on the conviction that endurance could defeat innovation, that the will to die could match the will to invent. On every island, that conviction had been tested, and on every island, it had been undone. In the ruins of Tokyo, children played among the burned-out shells of factories that had once supplied the imperial army. In the caves of Iwo Jima and Peleliu, the air still carried the scent of oil and ash. The empire's fire had gone out, leaving behind not victory, not even defeat, only memory. The laughter of 1943, when American tanks were mocked as clumsy, when flamethrowers were dismissed as folly, now belonged to ghosts. The age of flesh and sword had yielded to the age of fire and steel. And as the sun rose over a nation in ruins, one truth lingered in the haze. The empire that sought eternity had been undone by its own refusal to change. The war ended, but its weapons lingered. In the silence that followed August 1945, the world surveyed what it had built and what it had burned. Among the debris of an empire, the flamethrower tank stood as both triumph and warning, the symbol of a war that had consumed everything, even its own necessity. Post-war analysts in Washington and Tokyo reviewed the records with uneasy admiration. Statistically, the M4A3R3 Zippo had been one of the most efficient weapons of the Pacific Campaign. It could do what artillery, bombs, and infantry could not: eliminate the hidden, the entrenched, the immovable. On paper, it had saved lives by ending battles faster. But beyond the numbers, its legacy defied measurement. The same reports that praised its utility called it psychologically devastating, a phrase that belonged as much to its users as its victims. The U.S. Army kept the Zippos for a time, storing them in depots across the Pacific. But the war that followed, in Korea and later in Vietnam, belonged to a new generation of warfare. Mobility, not fire, became the doctrine. Precision began to replace spectacle. By 1950, most flame tanks were decommissioned, their fuel systems corroded, their steel hulls repurposed or left to rust under open skies. The Army's own manuals described them with an unfamiliar tone: tactically valuable, morally hazardous. In Japan, the silence was deeper. The veterans who had fought from caves and tunnels rarely spoke of the fire. To them, it was not a weapon, but a memory too heavy for words. The official histories of the Imperial Army mention the flamethrowers only in passing, a peculiar American device, a method of rapid clearing. Between those phrases lay an ocean of unspoken horror. For the survivors of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Saipan, remembrance became a form of endurance. Historians who later examined the Pacific campaigns found themselves divided. Some saw the flame tanks as a necessary instrument, the only solution to fortresses carved from stone and faith. Others saw in them the embodiment of modern war's descent into mechanized cruelty. They were efficient, one scholar wrote, because they burned away everything that made resistance human. The debate never settled. Efficiency or atrocity, the line blurred in the smoke. In museums across the United States and Japan, a few remnants remain. In Hawaii, one M4A3R3 sits in the sun, its armor pitted and flaked, the nozzle fused with rust. Tourists pass by it without knowing what it once carried. The plaque speaks of innovation and victory. It does not speak of the sound, the roar, the hiss, the silence that followed. In Tokyo, a small museum exhibit displays a melted helmet recovered from a cave on Okinawa. The caption reads only, "Found near a flame tank position, 1945. For the engineers who once built them, the flame tanks were a reminder of invention's double edge. Many went on to design jet engines, industrial pumps, even firefighting systems. They had moved from creating fire to controlling it. Progress, in its own way, had turned from heat toward precision. The wars of the future would be fought not with flame, but with light, guided bombs, radar, and the atom's invisible fire. Yet in the quiet corners of veterans' reunions, the old operators of the Zippos sometimes spoke in low voices about the weapon that defined their youth. They remembered the vibration of the pumps, the smell of burned oil, the glow that lingered long after the trigger was released. One Marine, decades later, described it simply, "We won with it, but it burned more than we ever meant it to." The flamethrower tank had ended resistance, not just on the battlefield, but in the human imagination. It marked the point where warfare ceased to be about courage or position, and became instead about reach, about who could strike first, furthest, and most completely. The weapon that once ruled the Pacific would never fire again. Its purpose fulfilled, its presence unbearable, it was left to fade beneath the same sun that had once glinted off its armor. And as the metal turned orange with rust, the world that made it turned toward a colder precision, trading fire for calculation and conscience for control. The Pacific War ended, but its lessons did not. In its aftermath, the world looked upon the blackened islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and understood that victory had not been clean. The war had proven that technology could erase distance, destroy fortresses, and bend nature itself to human will. But it had also revealed a truth that no engineer could refine. Invention without restraint becomes terror. The flamethrower tank, born from desperation, had embodied both genius and grief. It was a masterpiece of adaptation, a weapon that turned engineering into dominance. Yet its success carried the weight of something darker. It had shown that progress and morality do not always advance together. In the pursuit of efficiency, war had made itself mechanical. Commanders praised the Zippo as the tool that shortened campaigns and saved lives. But among those who used it, few ever celebrated it. They understood what the weapon truly represented, the moment when courage gave way to combustion, when victory came not through skill, but through certainty. Every burst of flame was absolute, and absolutes, in war, are dangerous. Historians studying the Pacific campaigns would later describe the weapon with clinical precision: range, output, ignition rate. But no table of figures could account for the silence it left behind, the silence of men who could no longer speak about what they had seen. It was a silence that followed them home, into quiet suburbs and empty kitchens, where the smell of fuel or the flicker of a match could summon memories best left unspoken. The moral weight of the flamethrower tank extended far beyond its battlefield. It became a symbol of what modern warfare had become, a contest not only of armies, but of imaginations. The same ingenuity that built bridges and airplanes had built a machine that could breathe fire. The boundary between creativity and cruelty had proven thinner than anyone dared to admit. In classrooms and military academies, the Zippo became a footnote, an example of tactical innovation, a relic of a war that pushed human endurance to its limit. Yet beneath the diagrams and specifications, a quieter lesson waited. That mastery of nature is not the same as mastery of the self. The flame that cleared the caves of Saipan had also burned away something unseen, the illusion that progress was inherently good. Every new weapon inherits its echo. The flamethrower tank's legacy lived on, not in steel or fuel, but in the questions it left behind. How far can necessity excuse invention? How much destruction can be justified by efficiency? These questions followed engineers into the jet age, the missile age, and finally, the atomic age, where distance no longer protected conscience and precision no longer protected morality. To remember the flamethrower tank is to remember the price of imagination. It stands as a monument to both human brilliance and its shadow, the instinct to create, even when creation consumes. It reminds us that the same hands capable of forging life-saving machines can also build instruments of perfect ruin. Fire, after all, is the oldest of human discoveries. The first tool, the first weapon, the first lesson in consequence. It is easy to start, impossible to contain, and hard to forget. In the ashes of the Pacific, amid the burned hills and silent tanks, one truth endures. Progress is never free, and every spark leaves its mark. In 1943, on the far edges of the Pacific, the Japanese army dismissed a rumor whispered through prisoner interrogations and intercepted reports that the Americans were building tanks that could breathe fire. Officers laughed at the idea. It sounded like fantasy, a tale for frightened recruits. To them, the tank was already a crude machine, heavy, clumsy, unsuited to the volcanic terrain of their island fortresses. The idea that such a vehicle could summon flame itself seemed absurd. They were wrong. 2 years later, on those same islands, they watched their fortresses vanish in sheets of fire. The laughter of 1943 had become the silence of 1945. The Sherman Zippo had rewritten the meaning of power. It was no longer enough to hold ground or to die upon it. The Americans had created something different, a weapon that fused industry with inevitability. Where steel could not penetrate, fire persuaded. No wall was too thick, no cave too deep, no courage sufficient. The same soldiers who once mocked the notion now found themselves surrounded by it. The world outside their bunkers turned to liquid flame. For the Marines who watched the inferno spread, victory came with a strange stillness. The Zippo did not fight in the traditional sense. It advanced, it breathed, and the battle ended. The weapon removed the drama of combat and replaced it with something colder, certainty. "You didn't win with a flamethrower," one Marine recalled. "You ended things." Each burst of fire was a sentence without reply. In the Pacific, courage had met chemistry, and chemistry had prevailed. The Japanese doctrine of endurance, of dying for the emperor, had met an enemy that could not be met on human terms. The battle between will and innovation was over before it began. The Sherman Zippo became the emblem of what the war itself had become. A struggle not just between nations, but between eras. The soldiers who fought with rifles and bayonets stood against a machine born of factories, logistics, and science. It was the moment when the modern age revealed its face, precise, relentless, impersonal. For the Americans, the weapon symbolized ingenuity. For the Japanese, inevitability. Every fortress destroyed was a message written in flame, that endurance alone could no longer defeat adaptation. The empire built on sacrifice was undone not by strength, but by imagination. When the war finally ended, the flame went out, but the memory lingered. On Saipan and Okinawa, the soil itself still smelled of burned fuel. In Tokyo, veterans returned to a homeland in ruins, their once sacred fortresses reduced to ash. They had fought to the end, as their code demanded, but the enemy they faced had been something new, not a man or an army, but an idea made real, that progress cannot be stopped by courage alone. In the years that followed, The world tried to forget the sight. The flamethrower tank was retired, its nozzles capped, its engines silenced. It had served its purpose too completely. But the lesson it carried did not fade. The Pacific War had proven that innovation would always outrun conviction, that survival, in the age of machines, belonged not to the brave, but to the adaptable. For those who fought on both sides, the memory remained less a triumph than a reckoning. The Japanese defenders who perished in their tunnels and the American tankers who watched them burn shared the same inheritance, a realization that war, once driven by valor, had entered a new dimension. In the quiet after victory, the veterans spoke little. Some prayed, some drank, some stared at the sunset over the Pacific and said nothing at all, because deep down they knew that something irreversible had begun. Humanity had looked into its own reflection and seen fire staring back. The age of the sword had ended. The age of flame had passed, but the idea behind both remained the same, that mankind's greatest weapon has never been steel, or fuel, or even fire. It has always been the will to imagine, and the blindness to what imagination can cost. They laughed once. They never laughed again.